Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, around the 15th anniversary of the first installment in one of my all-time favorite franchises, here I will be talking about my thoughts on Uncharted 1, Drake's Fortune, which is a really nostalgic game for me, with it being the first game I ever played on my PS3 back in the day. But despite that nostalgia, I'll be honest, if it wasn't for the fact that it's part of the Uncharted series, I'd probably just simply not like this game nowadays. Now, I know it has become the norm to say that Uncharted 1 has not aged well, but I mean, it really hasn't. Not just in how the game plays, but for me, in also how the game is designed, with my most recent replay really reminding me how much this game's structure just annoys me, and also how uninspired I feel like the narrative is as well. Despite that fact though, for the time, this is a game that did push the gaming medium forward with how much emphasis was put on its cinematic nature. I feel like that at least is something to be commended. Now, like my other retrospectives, I will be going through the game chapter by chapter, but first I do want to talk about a few general things. Now, as we would later expect from the Uncharted series, this game is a third-person action-adventure game that has a mix of platforming, shooting, and puzzle sections, though something this game really struggles with is finding the right balance of these sections, with a bulk of the game feeling really combat heavy, which I personally find pretty annoying, especially when the shooting mechanics in this game are rather lackluster, and really most of the gameplay elements of this game, and really the series as a whole, have never been as refined as I would like them to be, especially within the original PS3 trilogy, where I always did feel like the platforming doesn't necessarily spawn the way that I would want it to. In general, feels very floaty. Gunplay has never been the series' strong suit either, pretty much being this baseline cover shooter. The puzzles in this game are far and few between, and even the ones that are there are not that notable. So, again, from a gameplay perspective, I never loved how this game played, to the point where I never actually even finished my first full playthrough of this game until years after my initial playthrough, well after the release of Uncharted 2, just because of how much I didn't love certain gameplay sections that kept impeding on my progress. Now, I do remember that there were a decent amount of sections in the original PS3 version that did utilize motion controls. However, more recently I have been playing this on the Nathan Drake collection, which did remove these mechanics, which I do think is a change for the better. Something else that's pretty notable here is that there is no health bar in the series, where the more damage that you end up taking causes the screen to fade in color, which is an interesting way to indicate health here, and I think also adds to the cinematic nature of the game. And it's obviously just become a staple for the series. Now, most of the other things I do want to talk about, I feel like I can talk about by running through the game. So let's just jump right into it. The game does start off with us instantly getting introduced to Nate and Elena as they find the long-lost coffin of Sir Francis Drake off the coast of Panama, with Nate claiming that Drake is his ancestor, despite Drake having been known for not having any heirs, with Nate having recruited Elena to help fund the expedition, with Elena recording the events to create a documentary. And here we do find that the coffin is empty, with the exception of Drake's diary, which becomes our guide throughout the game's puzzles moving forward. And really all of this is a great introduction to these two characters here, with Nate instantly coming off as this fun-loving, charismatic figure, and Elena playing off of him pretty well here, though I will say that I do find the dialogue pretty clunky here, with it being blatantly filled with exposition. And while the characters are likable throughout this game, I do feel like they lack depth, with them feeling like modifications of characters that we've already seen from something like Indiana Jones, which is obviously something that this game was clearly inspired by. And Nate in particular doesn't feel as defined of a character here, with him making a lot of decisions throughout this game that don't really align with how he acts in future installments. But eventually they are attacked by pirates, which gives us this short combat section atop the boat that is really the entirety of chapter 1, that really just acts as a tutorial to this game's combat, with it teaching you how to shoot and do melee combat. Obviously pretty basic stuff there. Though here we do eventually get saved by Sully, really forming this iconic trio that the series has become known for. And we end up having this scene with the three discussing the plan moving forward, where we find out that Drake was searching for El Dorado, the lost city of gold, that we eventually find out is actually just a gold statue. But this leads to us following his trail for what ends up being really the majority of the game. And to do so, we end up going to an Amazon rainforest. But before that, we have Nate and Sully betraying Elena by proceeding on their own, which is a pretty jarring scene now, looking at it from the rest of the series, where this is really the only time that I can think of where Nate actively betrays an ally of his, where moving forward, it really is Nate getting backstabbed left and right throughout the games. With the only times him doing something deceivious is when we know that the person that he's doing that to is actually an antagonist. So it is humorous that this is the first game in the series and it shows Nate kind of being a dick here right at the beginning, which again feels kind of out of character based on what we know about him moving forward. But this does lead to chapter 2, which mostly focuses around us navigating through the Force along with Sully, allowing us to get to know their dynamic, with Sully really coming off as this likable mentor figure for Nate, where you can clearly tell their extended background through these conversations. And really, this entire section of the game just feels very notable to me, mainly because of how many times I've played it. As again, I did end up playing the game from the beginning quite often, just because I would always get stuck at a certain section in the game when I was younger. So because I do have pretty fond memories of this section of the game. But eventually we do stumble across some ruins, and this section is mostly comprised of puzzles and platforming until we end up finding a German U-boat in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, which ends up starting chapter 3, where we have this really convoluted platforming section in order to find a way on top of the U-boat that I kind of find annoying considering how much it revolves around swinging on vines and shimming across cliffs. But once we get to the U-boat, we do end up finding a missing page from Drake's diary that tells us the location of where the statue is located. But after escaping the U-boat, we are confronted by the two main antagonists of the game in Roman and Navarro, two of the most generic villains in the history of media, with Roman just being this boring treasure hunter guy that feels like a typical villain from an Indiana Jones or a Bond film, and Navarro ends up being this bland mercenary leader that also ends up having an extensive knowledge of archaeology, which feels like a trait that they gave to him just so they could explain the later plot twists. But during this conversation, we do learn that Sully owns Roman money, and Sully had told Roman about the treasure to get him off his back. And this is also just kind of weird to see Sully's loyalty being kind of ambiguous throughout this game, with there being another point later on in the game where it really comes to question whose side Sully is on. As again, like, this is never mentioned again throughout the series. Like, beyond this, Sully becomes blindly loyal to a fault to Nate, to the point where that's obviously like one of the major storylines of Uncharted 3. But again, here Sully's loyalty is questioned quite a bit. But here we do also see Roman attempt to kill Nate, only for him to shoot Sully instead, which also would have been bizarre to think that if they had actually killed Sully here and we just never saw him again. But Nate ends up being saved by the U-boat's explosion, which allows him to flee. And really that ends up being the rest of the chapter, where it ends up being focused around these combat sections of us having to fight off Navarro's mercenaries as we retrace our steps from the last chapter. And along the way, we do get reunited with Elena, who has a fun reintroduction through punching Nate in the face. But we eventually get back to the truck, and next thing you know, we're on a seaplane headed towards the island where the statue is located, which is where the remainder of the game ends up taking place, which really does minimize the scale of this game, especially in comparison to future games that have a wide range of locales, while this game mostly focuses around this one island. But this does lead to chapter 4, where the plane gets shot down and we get separated from Elena after parachuting off, and we spend the chapter finding our way to the wreckage of the plane, during which we get a ridiculous amount of combat sections, really non-stop combat sections that kind of becomes the norm from this point forward, where this is really where, again, the balance between all these different gameplay styles to me becomes so wonky, really from this point till the end of the game. And I remember it was in the middle of this chapter that I remember stopping my first playthrough of the game because of how much I hated some of these combat sections. After reaching the plane, we do end up seeing Elena's parachute at the top of a nearby fortress that leads to chapter 5, that does start with us climbing on the outside of the fortress, which is a pretty cool moment, especially when the camera like zooms out and it really just shows you the scale of this set piece. But afterwards we get more fighting as we fight our way to the top of the fortress, only to find that Elena's obviously gone. And after more combat sections, we get to chapter 6 for more combat sections in the fortress. Now, to be fair, there is like one puzzle section along the way and there's a platforming section, but really this part of the game just feels so uninspired to me, and I do feel like the level design is also just kind of confusing at points. On my last replay, I just did not remember exactly where I was going and got lost for a bit, but eventually we do end up getting captured by the pirates, leading to us meeting their leader, Eddie Raja, this colleague of Nate's that ends up being a minor antagonist here. But despite despite that, he is clearly the bad guy here that has the most personality, but also ends up being one that I never found menacing through him pretty much being undercut every time he's on screen. Here with Elena busting us out of prison in the middle of their conversation, leading us to chapter 7, which comprises of this set piece where Elena is driving the truck and we have to shoot the enemies down, and kind of your generic Uncharted set piece. Nowadays, though, again, I suspect that this was pretty impressive for the time, especially from a technical standpoint. But this leads to chapter 8, where we find a flooded city, and bizarrely here we have Nate want to give up, which feels very un-Nate-like, and it's actually Elena, the one that actually wants to continue on, which again just feels out of character based on how these characters act in future installments. But again, it's scenes like this that make it pretty clear to me that the Nate in this game feels pretty different from the ones that we end up seeing moving forward. But gameplay wise, this chapter and chapter 9 both comprise of using a jet ski to navigate through the flooded city, and at some points getting off to do some really tedious combat sections. And also these jet ski sections are just really dreadful to me as well. I really hate them. They control really clunkily, and you have to avoid these barrels that are in the water, and it's just really annoying, especially when there's like enemies shooting at you as well. It's just, again, not fun to be playing those sections. But eventually you get to chapter 10, which starts when we get to the customs house, where we learn that the El Dorado statue was moved further inland because the game needs to be longer. But really, this scene is pretty strong here, as it really shows us Nate and Elena's relationship, with Nate talking about his relation to Drake, showing her Drake's ring, and us getting the explanation of the Sic Parvis Magna inscription, which ends up explaining how Nate found Drake's coffin to begin with the ring having the coordinates to the location. And all of this really felt as if Nate was initially intended to actually be Drake's descendant, which obviously in Uncharted 4 is fully confirmed that that isn't the case, but to me this scene and the way that it's portrayed really makes it feel like a retcon. Now afterwards we do get more annoying combat sections that carry through to chapter 11 as well. So there we do end up getting separated briefly from Elena, only for us to be reunited with her having recorded footage that reveals that Sully is still alive. Though here we do suspect that he is working with Roman and Navarro, which does put some doubt over his intentions to the player, though initially Nate seems to be resolute in his trust of Sully. Though, weirdly, the scene ends with Nate saying that he's gonna beat the crap out of him, which again feels very out of character for Nathan Drake. And especially the Nate Drake that we know in terms of his relationship to Sully. This just felt very jarring to me. And also something I found funny is that not too long afterwards, conveniently, Elena ends up losing her camera, making it feel like as if the writers would say, oh, we gotta get rid of this now that has no real narrative purpose for being there. But eventually it would lead up to chapter 12, where we get the last of the jet ski sections, but this one probably easily being the most annoying of the bunch, where you have the ride uphill along the river that has explosive barrels floating down, and again you having to ride upwards through these narrow canals and avoiding enemies along the way. It's again not fun. Not a good section of the game. But chapter 13 has us nearing the monastery where Sully is located, but first we have to get through more combat sections, so that's obviously fun. But eventually we do reach this plaza area right in front of the monastery that, guess what, we have another major fight in, but this is where I do feel like the enemies start to become ridiculously overpowered as well, with them having a lot more powerful weapons like RPGs and snipers that just really make these endgame fights even more annoying to get through. But eventually we entered the monastery where, again, they try to make you think that Sully's working with the enemy until they reveal that he was just faking it all the time. And we get the reveal that it was Drake's journal that ended up taking the bullet for him, which again felt very convenient. But this once again brings this iconic trio together, and we have them work together to find the entrance to the underground, where we spend chapter 14 with more combat sections before listening in on a conversation between the antagonists that felt very cliched. But through this we do hear about how the island is cursed and something has been killing Eddie Raja's men, which obviously foreshadows the more supernatural elements of the game. Chapter 15 starts after escaping the underground, and we end up having another platforming section that has us navigating around the top of the monastery. That can get kind of annoying due to you needing some precise jumps at points, and again the platforming sections are a bit floaty, but this has always been a really notable section to me. But shockingly, here we do find out that the treasure is conveniently under Roman's base, meaning we get more combat and a short puzzle before getting separated from Sully. as we enter the treasure vault, leading to chapter 16, where we get what's probably the most notable puzzle of the game to me, where we follow the correct numbers to find the right path. And guess what? Afterwards, we get more combat. That is until we reach the heart of the vault, where we find the body of Francis Drake having died in his pursuit, which leads to Nate saying "so much for greatness," which again doesn't feel in line with how Nate would react in further games. And he ends up leaving Drake's ring here, which, considering how much emphasis is put into this game of Nate's relation to Drake, I would have expected this scene to have a bit more gravitas to it. But we do follow this up with chapter 17, where while escaping the vault, we end up encountering Eddie Raja, who has been chased down by these mutated creatures that I remember when I first played this game, I felt like this was ridiculous. That they just all of a sudden just add these supernatural elements to the game here, to a game that had been pretty grounded up until this point. But again, this does very much feel in line with that of like this Indiana Jones-esque story that it's trying to tell here. But this does lead to a combat section that I remember finding brutal the first time I played it, with the mutants being these really powerful enemies that end up killing you in a couple hits. And through that, it is interesting to see like Nate and Eddie have to work together here, though Eddie ends up being killed before Nate is able to escape. But again, this ends up adding a much more difficult enemy type to the game here in the endgame, which was just not fun to play with. Though I did like the element of the El Dorado not being a treasure as expected, but instead being a cursed item that ends up mutating those around it. Again, adding to this theme of the corruption that comes from greed. But eventually this leads to chapter 18, where we find out that the vault leads to an abandoned German bunker, which leads to Nate setting out on his own to restore power to the bunker so that they can escape. So we do have a pretty notable platforming section across the base, leading to a pretty dark set of tunnels that comprises of chapter 19, where we get surrounded by mutants, which felt like a section out of a horror game. And again, like I always hated this section whenever I play it, but through this we find out that the Germans had sought the statue during World War II, which caused them to become mutants as well, while also learning that Drake's death did not come in vain, with him actually having not failed in his goal of finding the treasure, but in reality him having found it and learned about the corruption that it sows, and through that have been trying to keep it on the island by flooding the city and destroying the ships before he was killed, which really recontextualizes his death here. And I guess you can say it develops Nate's character, and like that's why he acts differently moving forward in the series. But I don't feel like the game accurately portrays that, with no real context or true indication of that development here. Now on the way back, we do see Elena having been captured by Roman and Navarro, which really starts the end game, where we do get this really annoying fight as we escape the bunker, where we have numerous snipers in this section. And to add to that, you also have to fight mutants on the ground, and again, that's just not fun. But I will say, I do find it humorous that in this first Uncharted game here, we do end up having these fights that involve both human and mutant enemies, which is something that, it's strange that they could do this in Uncharted 1, considering they struggled to do the same thing in The Last of Us Part 1, which was void of fights that had both human and infected enemies. And even in Part 2, there's barely any. So again, I find it humorous that Uncharted 1 has a fight of that scale. But this does lead to chapter 20, where after escaping, we are reunited with Sully for a series of really annoying fights, with the one in the plaza outside the monastery being the one that actually stopped me from finishing the game back in the day, where I got just so annoyed with how many enemies in the area had RPGs and snipers, that was the point where I stopped playing until after I'd already finished Uncharted 2, which is kind of funny because it's like literally like 20 minutes away from the end. But again, I still get annoyed at this section now. I mean, it's just not a fun section to play. And like immediately afterwards, you have another like kind of similar fight inside the monastery with similar style of enemies. So again, it's just kind of annoying, the type of enemies that show up in the end game here. But once we end up reaching the underground, we do get to chapter 21, where we find out that Roman has secured the statue, and after the encouragement of Navarro, Roman ends up opening the casket, which ends up infecting him, leading to Navarro killing him and revealing that this was his plan all along, that he now plans on stealing the statue for himself to sell as a bioweapon. And I mean, this was so cliched and really makes Navarro a really underwhelming final antagonist here, with us not even getting to know him that much in this game, as he's kind of just there with Roman for most of it, and it just felt like a way for them to have a shocking twist at the end that, again, no one really cared about. But the statue ends up being lifted out by helicopter, and we do have this short bit of gameplay of us having to make our way through some guards and mutants in order to jump onto the helicopter, which felt very convenient that Nate was able to hold on long enough to land on the freighter, which ends up starting the final chapter, which comprises of the final boss battle against Navarro, which ends up being a string of smaller combat sections where Navarro shoots from the middle with the sniper that can instantly kill you and also destroy your cover, which again is an annoying element of it. But the real goal is to actually kill the guards around him as he runs away when you do so. And I do find this second of these areas to be the most annoying, as there is no checkpoint in between the first and second. And the second has a larger amount of enemies, and also all the boxes that you use to cover are destructible there. So again, I do find it very annoying, but really most of the fight is pretty easy. And once you follow him to the deck, we have a short section of trying to avoid his hits as you run up to him to fist fight him, which ends up being the final bit of gameplay. With the story end up ending as you would expect it to. Obviously, Nate rescues Elena. Navarro tries to go in for one more shot, but Nate, after giving his one-liner, pushes the helicopter into the water, which pulls Navarro in as well, along with the statue, conveniently ending all these conflicts with one single move. We also end the game with Elena returning Drake's ring to Nate before Sully arrives to rescue them, revealing that he escaped with some treasure, and we get this happily ever after of them riding off into the sunset. Again, really generic fare, but kind of just feels in line with the genericness of Uncharted 1, which is really just a baseline story to me in almost every aspect, feeling like it's just copying off of Indiana Jones but trying to adapt it to video game form. The main thing making this stand out in the modern day is the acting, where the performances of the main three really make for a really likable trio here. But most of what this game does from a narrative perspective is further improved as the series progresses. While gameplay wise, the game is so combat heavy, it leads to a bevy of annoying combat sections that do overall harm my opinion of the game. But with that is Uncharted 1. Again, a game that has not aged well to me. But again, for the time that it was released, it was easily one of the most cinematic games ever made, and it had some of the best performances ever in a video game. Again, being further proof of where the video game medium can go. And while many games have done what Uncharted 1 did at the time and have done it better at this point, including literally every other main game in the series, I do think this is still a technical feat for the time, and I do have a great level of respect for the game, especially for its impact on the gaming medium. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on Uncharted Drake's Fortune. Now, at this point, I've done retrospectives for most of the series. I do plan on continuing on with the original trilogy by the time of their respective anniversaries, which are obviously 2 years apart from now, so that's quite a while. But again, I just still plan on doing videos on them down the road. And obviously stay tuned for more game retrospectives and rankings as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.